In a small corner of the internet, a woman named Betty Whittaker became the center of a storm. What began as empathy turned into judgment, and what began as curiosity turned into spectacle. Across platforms, especially Facebook, her name circulates as both a punchline and a point of pity. For some, she is the heart of a family trapped in dysfunction. For others, she's the cause of it. The story of Betty Whittaker is not just about one woman, it's about roles. The roles we inherit, the ones we perform, and the ones we're forced to live out when the world starts watching. It's about the drama triangle, a psychological pattern that turns life into a rotating stage of victims. Villains and heroes. Betty, to some, has become all three. The comment sections tell the story first. Each post, each thread becomes an echo chamber of opinion. She's weak. She's enabling. She doesn't care. Poor. Betty needs help. Betty is the problem. The voices merge into a chorus of analysis from strangers who know her only through clips and captions. And yet, in those reactions, a mirror forms, a reflection of how easily people move between compassion and condemnation from a psychology standpoint. Betty represents something deeply familiar, the role of the caretaker who cannot say no, the one who absorbs chaos, smooths edges, excuses behavior, and protects others even when it costs her peace. It's a role that looks selfless on the outside, but can become self-destructive over time. In every family system, there are archetypes, patterns passed down like old furniture. Pieces that fit awkwardly, but stay because no one wants to throw them out. There's always someone who fixes, someone who fights, someone who flees, and someone who falls silent. In the Whittaker story, Betty became the stabilizer. The one who didn't confront directly, but held things together just enough to function. But online, that role has been reinterpreted as weakness. The more people watched, the more they expected Betty to change, to confront, to rebel, to stop the chaos that surrounded her. The criticism grew sharper, and what once was sympathy turned into scorn. Somewhere in that shift, Betty transformed from victim to villain. The concept of the drama triangle helps explain how this happens not just in Betty's life, but in all of ours. Developed by psychiatrist Stephen Karpman, the triangle describes how people get trapped in cycles of conflict by playing three roles: the victim, the villain, and the hero. And in the process, Betty became a symbol of both empathy and frustration. The footage of her with her dog shows something raw and revealing. Betty holds the small animal in her arms, cooing softly. "That's my old baby doggy. You gonna say hi, puppy? Mommy's got me. I ain't going nowhere." There's love in her voice. There's gentleness, but there's also something deeper, a comfort she seems to find in nurturing, in caretaking something that won't argue back, won't disappoint her, won't blame her. In that simple act, Betty shows the psychological refuge of caretakers everywhere. When the human world becomes too chaotic, they pour their tenderness into pets, plants, or strangers online. It's the same instinct that keeps them in relationships that drain them, the belief that love and protection can heal anyone, even when it cannot heal themselves. The internet, however, rarely grants grace for complexity. Compassion has a short attention span online. Once a figure becomes controversial, the nuance disappears. The same viewers who once praised Betty for her kindness now call her delusional. The ones who urged empathy now mock her inability to see what's happening. This public flip from adoration to accusation isn't unique to Betty, it's a phenomenon in digital culture. We build people up to tear them down. We assign roles because it helps us make sense of chaos. And in doing so, we recreate the drama triangle ourselves, the audience as hero, Betty as victim, and eventually Betty as villain. Psychologically, this satisfies something in us. It gives us the illusion of moral order. By blaming Betty, the audience can feel righteous. By rescuing her through comments, donations, or messages of support, they can feel compassionate. But both are still inside the triangle. Both keep the pattern alive. When a person like Betty is surrounded by strong personalities, dominant men, manipulative relatives, loud critics, she may adapt by disappearing into submission. Her silence becomes armor. Her compliance becomes currency. And in families that run on control and shame, quietness is mistaken for agreement. In that environment, to resist would mean to risk exile. To speak up would mean to lose the fragile bonds that hold the family together. So, Betty stays, and staying becomes its own kind of coping. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. It happens when someone is exposed to prolonged stress or dysfunction and comes to believe that nothing they do can change the outcome. Even when escape becomes possible, the mind still says, "Why bother?" It's not laziness, it's adaptation. The nervous system adjusts to survive what it cannot fix. That's the deeper layer of Betty's story. The one that gets lost between the memes and the comment threads. The one that explains why people stay in unhealthy systems. Even when the door is open, every role in the drama triangle carries its own emotional reward. For the victim, it's sympathy. For the villain, it's control. For the hero, it's validation. But none of them lead to growth. They are temporary roles that feel real until someone steps out of the triangle entirely into awareness. Accountability and balance. For Betty, that step is harder than it looks. Her support system is tangled with the same people who harm her. Her identity has been shaped by decades of caretaking. And her self-worth is measured by how much she can hold, not how much she can change. The online discourse ignores this nuance. It prefers simple narratives: Betty good, Betty bad, Betty crazy, Betty trapped. But human psychology is not that simple. People can be both victim and villain. They can hurt others while trying to help them. They can protect themselves in ways that look like denial. The real tragedy isn't just Betty's situation, it's the way the internet consumed it as entertainment. What could have been a collective moment of reflection about family, trauma became another round of social media spectacle, underneath the noise. However, lies a truth that applies far beyond one family in West Virginia. When we witness dysfunction, we often project our own roles into it. We judge the parts we recognize in ourselves. Some viewers identify with Betty's exhaustion, the endless effort to keep everyone calm. Some identify with her critics, the frustration of watching someone not act. Some see themselves in the chaos around her, remembering their own families, their own entanglements. And in that projection, the story becomes less about Betty and more about us. The comment sections prove it. They're not just reactions, they're confessions. Each post reveals how people relate to control, blame, and empathy. The dragging of Betty becomes a public catharsis, an anonymous therapy session disguised as moral outrage. Psychology reminds us that when a community vilifies one person, it often does so to avoid facing its own discomfort. We see it in every viral downfall, every public shaming, every cycle of build-up and backlash. Betty's story is simply the latest vessel for that collective emotion, but within her quiet voice, her gentle way of speaking to a small dog, there's a reminder that people contain contradictions. The same woman who frustrates us might also teach us something about endurance. The same passivity that infuriates her critics might be the reason she survived this long. The next chapter of Betty's story, whether she remains a victim, a villain, or something else entirely, will depend on whether she or the people around her can step off the triangle, whether awareness can replace reaction, because until that happens, every conversation about Betty online or offline will continue to orbit the same loop: sympathy, judgment, blame, repeat. And in that loop, the audience becomes part of the same psychological cycle they claim to critique. In the story of Betty Whittaker, every action, every silence, every small gesture seems to carry symbolic weight. Viewers search her face for meaning. They examine her tone, her body language, her pauses, as if each moment contains an answer to the family's dysfunction. What they often fail to see is that the answer lies not in Betty's expression, but in the system around her. Family systems theory teaches that no one exists in isolation. Every member of a family plays a part in maintaining the home's emotional balance, even when that balance is unhealthy. One person's outburst depends on another's silence. One person's control depends on another's compliance. Dysfunction is not random, it's organized. And in the Whittaker family, Betty became the emotional anchor. The one holding chaos by its edges, too afraid to let go. The internet calls that weakness. Psychology calls it homeostasis. In every system, there's an invisible agreement. This is how we survive. Sometimes that means keeping secrets. Sometimes it means excusing abuse. Sometimes it means pretending everything is fine even when it isn't. Betty's role fits that pattern perfectly. When the louder personalities BJ, Larry, Kenny explode, Betty's response is to shrink. When tension rises, she soothes. When pain surfaces, she diverts. She doesn't stop the cycle. She slows it like a dam that leaks just enough to keep from bursting. To understand Betty, you have to understand the drama triangle not as a metaphor but as a living map. Betty has moved through each corner of that triangle more times than she likely realizes. As the victim, she embodies helplessness. I can't do anything about this. It's too hard. That tone, soft, resigned, is the soundtrack of exhaustion. It's the voice of someone who's been told her needs don't matter for so long that she stopped naming them. As the villain, Betty occasionally redirects her frustration inward and outward. She blames herself for not being stronger, for not standing up. She blames others for not helping the way she imagined. This is what psychologist Stephen Cartman described as villaining toward the self, and the other, the emotional pendulum that swings between guilt and resentment. And as the hero, Betty comforts everyone but herself. She nurtures, deflects, feeds, forgives. In the video where she cradles her small dog, her voice turns tender and childlike. Mommy's got me. I ain't going nowhere. It's a moment that feels pure, but underneath it, the psychology is complex. The dog becomes a safe recipient of Betty's caregiving impulse, the same instinct she uses to manage the human chaos around her. But unlike the people in her life, the dog doesn't talk back, doesn't demand, doesn't hurt. It simply receives. That's why people who live long inside trauma often bond so deeply with animals. It's not just affection, it's refuge. When empathy becomes a burden, they give it somewhere it can stay unbroken. The internet, of course, doesn't see the nuance. It sees only the surface. It sees Betty the same way reality television frames its subjects, as a character designed to provoke reaction. People don't just watch Betty. They participate in her emotional ecosystem. They diagnose her. They assign motives. They debate whether she's complicit or coerced. And through that participation, they become part of the very triangle they critique. In Cartman's terms, the online audience often positions itself as the hero. They believe they're rescuing Betty by exposing her story, by criticizing her family, by pushing her toward awareness. But heroing can quickly turn into control. When people believe they're saving someone, they stop listening to what that person actually needs. The rescuer becomes the new villain, imposing help that reinforces dependence rather than freedom. Many of us, as Cartman once said, got trained to live in a state of victimhood. That training doesn't only apply to individuals, it applies to cultures. Entire communities learn to operate within the triangle. On social media, victimhood can even become a kind of currency. Suffering becomes spectacle. Empathy becomes performance. People compete for the role of the most wronged, the most righteous, the most informed. Betty's situation is amplified by this cultural loop. When she appears fragile, people empathize. When she appears indifferent, they turn on her. Either way, they feed the cycle. The internet becomes both her rescuer and her persecutor, praising her in one comment, mocking her in the next. This duality reveals something deeper about human psychology. We are drawn to stories of brokenness because they allow us to process our own. But instead of doing the internal work, we outsource it to strangers. We watch Betty, we analyze Betty. We argue about Betty because it's easier than examining the Betty inside our own lives. The mother who stayed too long. The friend who couldn't say no. The self that keeps rescuing people who don't want to be saved. In that way, Betty becomes symbolic. She's not just a woman from a struggling family. She's a reflection of a psychological truth, that people mistake endurance for healing. Betty's endurance, her ability to survive the environment without collapsing, looks like strength from the outside. But endurance without growth is just survival with better PR. There's a phrase in trauma psychology, frozen functioning. It describes people who appear to operate normally cooking, cleaning, working, smiling, while internally stuck in a loop of fear and exhaustion. They do everything, but nothing changes. Betty's calm demeanor, her gentle repetition of, "It's okay," and "I'm fine," could easily be mistaken for peace. In reality, it might be the quiet of someone who's run out of fight. And when someone has run out of fight, the world often mistakes their silence for agreement. That's where the villain label begins. When Betty doesn't stand up, when she doesn't challenge the men around her, the audience interprets it as complicity. She lets it happen, they say. She's enabling. But from a psychological standpoint, silence is not always agreement. Sometimes it's the only safety mechanism left. Survivors of prolonged stress often develop fawn responses, an instinct to please or pacify perceived threats to avoid conflict. The fawn response is the least understood of the trauma reactions, overshadowed by fight, flight, and freeze. But for many people, especially women in patriarchal or abusive structures, it becomes their primary mode of survival. They learn to soothe aggressors, to anticipate moods, to adapt constantly. It's a skill that looks like kindness but is rooted in fear. That's what makes the online criticism so striking. People expect Betty to display strength as they define it, to yell, to confront, to escape. But her entire nervous system may be wired to avoid exactly those responses. What they call weakness may be the only thing that's ever kept her safe. Still, there's an uncomfortable truth beneath all this compassion. Survival strategies can cause harm, too. In protecting others, Betty may have enabled their dysfunction. In avoiding confrontation, she may have allowed toxicity to grow unchecked. That's the paradox of the caretaker. The same qualities that make them empathetic can also make them complicit. It's not malice. It's misplaced loyalty. Psychologist John Bradshaw once said, "In a dysfunctional family, loyalty is often confused with love." Betty's loyalty to family, to image, to stability has become both her shield and her shackle. The internet wants her to choose herself, but choosing herself would mean betraying everything she's been taught to protect. That's not a single decision. It's a psychological rebirth, and rebirths are painful from a wider lens. Betty's story sits at the intersection of two modern obsessions, reality and relatability. People crave authenticity but punish vulnerability. They demand transparency but devour weakness. When Betty appears too polished, they accuse her of hiding. When she appears too raw, they call her unstable. There's no space for imperfection to exist without interpretation. Meanwhile, the comment sections continue like rolling thunder. Some plead for compassion. Others dissect every movement. They argue over whether she's sick, scared, or sinister. And in doing so, they keep the drama triangle alive. The rescuers feel morally superior. The villains feel justified. The victims feel seen. Everyone plays their part. The longer this continues, the less it becomes about Betty at all. She becomes an avatar for collective emotion, a vessel for empathy, anger, frustration, projection. In every viral moment, we see the same process. A real person transformed into a symbol. The complexity of their humanity flattened for consumption. That flattening is psychologically violent in its own way. It denies people the right to be contradictory, to be both kind and complicit, fragile and resilient. It turns psychology into entertainment, forgetting that behind every diagnosis, there's a human being. There's a moment in one of the videos where Betty glances at the camera just a flicker, almost imperceptible. Her face softens, her lips part, and then she looks away. It's a look of awareness, as if she knows she's being watched, as if she's half in and half out of the performance. That fleeting moment captures the tragedy of her situation. She is living a private life on a public stage, with millions of critics interpreting her silence. In that silence, though, there's also power, because silence forces reflection. It makes the audience confront their discomfort. It invites questions rather than answers. What if Betty is not meant to be saved? What if her story is not a cautionary tale but a mirror showing us the cycles we perpetuate in our own lives? The drama triangle doesn't just describe dysfunctional families. It describes the structure of modern discourse. Every social issue, every scandal, every trending topic follows the same pattern. A victim emerges, a villain is identified, and heroes rush to fix or destroy. The cycle generates attention, engagement, outrage, and then repeats with a new subject. The roles rotate, but the pattern remains. Betty's story reveals the emotional cost of that cycle. When human lives become narrative fuel, empathy turns into exhaustion. Viewers begin to feel disillusioned, not just with her, but with themselves. They start to question their own motives. Why am I watching this? Why do I care? Why can't I look away? Those questions mark the beginning of awareness. The first, step off the triangle. Stepping off doesn't mean abandoning compassion. It means shifting from reaction to reflection. It means seeing Betty not as a project, but as a person. It means recognizing that understanding someone's psychology is not the same as possessing it. In the end, Betty Whittaker's greatest lesson might not come from her words, but from her endurance. In a world obsessed with performance, she embodies a quieter truth, that surviving chaos without becoming it is a form of strength. Even when it looks like surrender, and perhaps the real challenge is not asking why Betty doesn't change, but asking why we need her to. The story of Betty Whittaker no longer belongs to Betty alone. It belongs to the crowd, to the millions who have watched, commented, reacted, and reinterpreted her life through their screens. In this new kind of public theater, the audience doesn't just observe, it participates. Each viewer becomes a character, choosing a side, choosing a role. The online world thrives on the illusion of moral clarity. Every story must have a hero to admire and a villain to despise. In the case of Betty Whittaker, the internet crowned itself as the hero. The audience believed it was saving her by exposing abuse, by analyzing her choices, by holding her family accountable. It was empathy packaged as entertainment. But the line between compassion and control is thin. In psychology, the hero complex describes a need to rescue others to feel valuable. Heroes thrive on brokenness because it gives them purpose. Their identity depends on someone else's suffering. In digital culture, that pattern has evolved into a collective behavior, entire communities gathering around a single figure, convincing themselves they are doing good, while feeding the very cycle that keeps the person trapped. When millions hero a stranger, they create a paradox. The more attention they give, the less freedom that person has. The more they try to fix her, the less agency she retains. Betty's life became not just a family drama, but a morality play that strangers edited in real time. Every frame of her story was dissected, re-uploaded, and repurposed for someone else's healing or outrage. There's an illusion of intimacy in online empathy. People speak as if they know her. Betty needs to do this. Betty should leave. Betty deserves better. They assign motives, diagnose trauma, and rewrite her story in ways that reflect their own wounds. They feel connected, but the connection is one-sided. Betty never asked to be their symbol. The internet as a collective hero doesn't rescue individuals. It rescues itself. Each act of commentary, each prayer post, each analysis video reinforces the rescuer's self-image as moral, informed, compassionate. The dopamine rush of righteousness replaces the discomfort of self-examination. By saving Betty, people momentarily escape their own helplessness, yet behind this cycle lies a shared discomfort with vulnerability. Society rewards strength, independence, and defiance. People like Betty, quiet, uncertain, visibly struggling, confront us with what we fear most, that we too might stay when we should leave, love when we should stop, forgive when it hurts us. It's easier to scorn Betty than to see her in ourselves. The psychology of spectatorship explains this paradox. When we watch someone else's pain, we experience emotional distance that makes reflection safer. We can study trauma without touching it. The screen becomes both a window and a shield. We feel empathy without risk, compassion without responsibility, but empathy without responsibility can turn cruel. When compassion becomes conditional, given only to those who perform redemption the way we expect, it stops being empathy and becomes performance. The moment Betty fails to behave like a perfect victim, the crowd withdraws its sympathy. She becomes the villain again. This reversal happens everywhere in digital culture. We love brokenness only when it fits the script. The moment it resists, we turn away. The cycle repeats: build up, break down, move on. In that churn, human beings become consumable. For Betty, this means her pain has been archived by strangers who will never meet her. Clips of her home, her family, her small gestures of affection, all preserved, edited, debated. Her suffering has become communal currency. People share it to feel, to react, to heal, but rarely to understand. What makes this cycle especially dangerous is its illusion of awareness. The internet believes it is diagnosing dysfunction, but in reality, it is mirroring it. The crowd that criticizes Betty's family dynamics reproduces them in digital form: chaos, blame, codependence, and endless emotional entanglement. The platform becomes the family. The comments become the living room. The argument never ends, and like any family system, the internet maintains its own homeostasis. Outrage keeps the cycle alive. Heroing keeps the hierarchy intact. Villainizing provides adrenaline. It feels like moral participation, but it's really collective regulation. Millions of nervous systems trying to calm themselves by directing focus outward. This is why stepping off the drama triangle is so radical. It asks for stillness instead of reaction, accountability instead of blame, understanding instead of rescue. It requires acknowledging that some stories are not ours to solve, that sometimes the kindest act is to watch without judgment or to turn away altogether. The lesson of Betty Whittaker is not that she is weak, but that the systems surrounding her, family, community, internet, thrive on roles that keep everyone spinning. Betty's silence, her softness, her confusion all exist within a larger cycle that mirrors our own behaviors. Her story forces us to ask, what part of this triangle am I playing? Because if Betty is trapped, so are we in our need to fix, to blame, to perform empathy. And until that need quiets, the drama never ends. Every story that begins in chaos longs for closure. But in the world of public narratives, closure rarely comes. For Betty Whittaker, the story doesn't end with redemption or revenge. It continues quietly in the unseen moments that don't make it to video, the pauses between the noise, the small gestures that never go viral. What we've witnessed of Betty's life is only the surface of something deeper. A woman shaped by years of family patterns, cultural expectations, and silent endurance. To understand her is to understand how roles are inherited, repeated, and sometimes mistaken for identity. The drama triangle victim, villain, hero exists because each role fulfills a psychological need. The victim seeks safety, the villain seeks control, and the hero seeks validation. Together, they create emotional gravity that keeps everyone orbiting the same center. It's familiar, predictable, and strangely comforting. Stepping off the triangle requires something that looks simple but isn't: awareness. Awareness breaks the spell. It doesn't erase pain or fix the past, but it reveals the pattern beneath the pain. Once the pattern is visible, the roles begin to lose their power. For Betty, awareness would mean recognizing that her caretaking is not the same as love, that rescuing people from their own consequences does not heal them, that guilt and compassion can coexist, but they are not the same emotion. It would mean learning to differentiate between peacekeeping and peace. This shift is not dramatic. It happens quietly in the refusal to explain, the pause before apologizing for someone else's behavior, the moment she chooses silence not out of fear but out of clarity. Healing rarely looks heroic. It often looks like nothing at all. The internet, on the other hand, thrives on spectacle. It doesn't know what to do with subtle growth. It craves transformation that can be captured in a thumbnail, a before and after, a confession, a comeback. But most healing happens off camera. When Betty holds her dog and whispers gentle words, that may be the truest form of recovery available to her. It's not performance. It's presence, psychologically. Healing begins when a person reclaims agency, not control over others, but over their own choices. In trauma therapy, this is called moving from victimhood to authorship. It's the difference between "this is happening to me" and "this is something I am experiencing." The language changes the lens. The story stops spinning, but awareness is not only Betty's task, It belongs to us too. The viewers, the commentators, the collective audience that turned one woman's pain into public content. To step off the triangle, the internet must confront its own addiction to outrage and rescue. The same dynamic that traps families in dysfunction traps communities in judgment. We consume stories like Betty's because they offer an emotional shortcut. They let us feel moral without reflection, involved without responsibility. Yet the moment we notice that impulse, the urge to fix, to condemn, to interpret, we are offered a choice. We can react or we can reflect. We can feed the triangle or we can step away. Stepping away doesn't mean indifference. It means refusing to use another person's suffering as emotional entertainment. It means holding space for empathy without ownership. In psychological terms, it's called differentiation, the ability to stay connected without being consumed. That's maturity. That's love with boundaries. Betty's story also reveals something fundamental about human resilience. Even within dysfunction, small moments of grace appear. Her laughter, her affection for her pets, her calm amid chaos. These fragments suggest that beneath the learned helplessness, a core of self still exists. People rarely lose themselves completely. They just bury the parts that weren't safe to show. The task of healing is excavation, unearthing what has been buried beneath fear, habit, and family roles. For some, that excavation requires therapy or community. For others, it begins with a single realization: I don't have to play this role anymore. When that awareness arrives, the world doesn't instantly change, but perception does. The villain begins to look human. The victim begins to look capable. The hero begins to look tired. The triangle collapses into something simpler: people trying, failing, and learning in real time. If Betty ever reaches that place, it won't be because the internet demanded it. It will be because she finally recognized that survival isn't the same as living. That forgiveness can include herself. That love doesn't have to mean self-erasure. And even if she never says those words aloud, the quiet shift would still matter. Perhaps that's the real message behind this story. That transformation doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's a subtle reorientation, a softening where there used to be fear, a boundary where there used to be guilt. The same woman who once carried everyone else's weight might one day decide that her own piece is enough, and when that day comes, there may be no camera to record it, no post to share it, no comment thread to interpret it. It will pass unnoticed, except by the person living it. And that's the point, because freedom from the triangle doesn't need an audience. It just needs awareness. The final question, then, is not whether Betty Whittaker is victim or villain. It's whether we, as observers, can stop needing her to be either when we let go of those roles. When we stop assigning moral scripts to human lives, something shifts. Empathy becomes quieter, more honest. We begin to see people not as symbols, but as stories still being written. In that stillness, there's room for everyone to step off the stage. Betty, her family, and the audience that watched. The triangle dissolves. What remains is what always should have been, just people trying to love, to heal, and to be seen. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.